I can't believe it. This year is almost over. That's right. We're here in December of 2021. And this month, for our Year in Review series, we're going to review positive things that happen throughout our community. It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Claville, and we'll be right back in just a moment. Welcome back. It's State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Claville, broadcasting live from the Norfolk State University from WNSB. Yes, it's the new sound of Hot 91, the soul of VA. I can't believe it. We are here at the end of this year, an academic year. We've got our producer here, Marvin Folks, also known to everyone Monday through Friday from 2 to 6 as DJ Scandalous, who will be conferred his master's in cybersecurity this week coming up. That's right. The semester is over. Graduating seniors, they have received their information and they are going to be walking across the stage. And again, this is a place where we see the future in you. It's a place where anyone can come and leave out somebody. And this graduation is no less than the same. As a matter of fact, we're really excited about all of our graduates that are graduating, and so proud of Marvin here for all that he has accomplished. And in addition to that, being here in the radio station. So he's done a lot. And for our commencement speaker, we will have none other than our very own Mr. Pharrell Williams. So we're excited about that. We've done a lot in conjunction with him over the past several years, and more specifically this year. And he's been such a driving force in our community. So we're excited again to have him here on our campus. So with that, I when I took a look at this series, Marvin, I call it the Year in Review series. We're doing it every December, and basically closing out the year, taking a look back. But this year is really special. And it's special because we went through a lot. 2021, well, really started in 2020. We went through a lot, and it's really just by, again, the grace of God, that we are not consumed, the mercies of God, that we're not consumed by the things that have taken us away. Now, again, we have loved ones, we have friends, and all of those individuals who have lost their lives or lost loved ones or have been impacted by the pandemic, or been impacted by just the other issues that we've seen throughout our society, that our heart goes out to them. It goes out to them. But one thing that we want to do is just be thankful. And last month, during the time of Thanksgiving, we had a thankful session and a show where we're just thankful for all things that we're blessed with. And here on the campus of Norfolk State University, we are extremely blessed, with the leadership, with our president, whom I affectionately call Dr. J, and all of us do. Since she's been here, I mean, so many great things have happened. And then others in executive cabinet and those who have come on campus, from the students to the new faculty, administrators, staff, everyone. And then also to the stakeholders, individuals who have actually come to say, hey, I want to invest in what Norfolk State is doing. I want to invest in the great things that are happening. Yeah, things are happening, and we have an opportunity to look back and say, in spite of it all, we are truly blessed and we're thankful and grateful that we have the leadership that we have, not just here at the university, but also in the General Assembly and also in in Washington, D.C. Our Congressman, Bobby Scott, of course, known as the smartest congressman on Capitol Hill, You know, I mean, he's doing great things, not just for the university, but also for the community as well, and the Commonwealth. But also our legislators, our alums who are in the General Assembly doing phenomenal things. From our very own President Pro Tem, Senator Lucas, Senator Spruill, also our very own head of the Black Caucus, Delegate Bagby, our newest delegate, Candy King, and of course, our very own Delegate Cliff Hayes, who represents the area here in Chesapeake, 77th District here in the House. Welcome, Delegate Hayes, to Stay the Water once again.
Good afternoon, Dr. Claville, and good afternoon to the Spartan Nation. It is such a blessing to be able to come on State of the Water once again here to Spartan Nation.
Absolutely. And listen, as you know, you and I, we talk quite a bit, and, we've seen the ups and the downs, we've seen the highs and the lows. And one thing that we've seen a lot, and it just didn't happen out of nowhere, but one thing that we've seen a lot in these last 4 years, and more specifically in 2021, are extreme highs for the university and for our region, is really because of the work that you guys are doing in the state legislature.
Oh, absolutely. If you look back historically on the funding for Norfolk State University, in a lot of ways, Virginia State universities are state HBCUs. They have not been funded and haven't gotten attention at the same tune of some of the other majority white institutions here in the Commonwealth of Virginia that are state funded. And so it's important for us to always remember the allies, the champions, if you will, for our HBCUs here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And you've named several of those key members of the HBCUs here in the Commonwealth of Virginia by way of not only funding them, but also having an intimate knowledge about the history of those institutions, and then the personal relationships having gone this way to form a foundation for us that we've built on with our furthering our education. Absolutely.
And that's significant, for us to understand, first of all, the history, where we were and what was withheld from us. Because if we don't understand the history of it, we won't understand the blessings that we have now and be able to really utilize it, to its fullest. And it's just not the funding aspect. But one thing I want to do in this series with you on this particular call, I want us to look back and talk about some of the positive legislation and the impact of it that was created, of course, in the 2020 session when it came into effect 2021, and of course came into law after the legislative session, and the impact on not just now, but for the future. I've got several policies that I want to take a look at, and I want you to jump in, and if there's anything else, let us know. But I think the number one piece of positive legislation is the voting rights legislation. Look, I think that's key. I think that's key because the vote is the most powerful nonviolent weapon that we have in our democracy. John Lewis, the late, great John Lewis. And it's our ability to have our voice. Tell us what you guys did in the legislature in order to impact our voting with the voting rights legislation.
Well, we all gathered around our dear sister, Marcia Price, who championed the Voting Rights Act, which encompassed a number of things to help us protect voting here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. As you mentioned before, in so many words, we have to remind people that in this democracy, the most powerful weapon that you have is voting, and that voting is one of the main tenets of that democracy in which we live in, by having as close as we can get to full stand in the way of people getting to the ballot box are the obstacles in which we must remove. But we also understand that does not come without a fight. And so we enter the fight not for the purpose of taking a snapshot in time, but to understand that we're to be prisoners of hope, that we will always be willing to work towards positive change in our democracy, and to make sure that every single person in this Commonwealth of Virginia who's eligible to vote has the ability to vote. Now, I said who are eligible to vote.
Right.
Well, that comes with a problem as well, because people will make it legal for you not to vote. So we have torn down many of those things that were making it illegal for people to participate in the democracy.
Wow.
And so when it came to making sure that folks have a right to vote early here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, voting should not be a certain day where everybody show up and it's a bottleneck at the polls, but we should be making it as accessible as possible. We all remember in our most recent history of President Obama being elected and what that was like, what that turnout was like.
Oh yeah.
And we've seen and heard and read and understood great prophets and people who make comments like, when you don't know better, you just keep working. But then when you know better, you do better.
That's right.
So since we know better about making it difficult for people with walkers and canes standing in the rain and cold, long lines on Election Day, that's what we saw during that election for President Obama.
Absolutely.
But now we know better. And so we ought to be able to create an infrastructure for voting that won't put our citizens in that type of situation, that they can participate in this democracy and all voices be heard. So we have now in the Commonwealth made it much easier to vote. For instance, early voting with no excuse is 45 days prior to an election.
Wow.
45 days. So there is no reason, no good excuse, no good reason why anybody of voting age is and registered to vote is not voting in these elections. Because, as people have said, you ought to vote in the election because your life depends on it.
Absolutely.
The truth is that is a fact. Your life does depend on it. Many of the policies that are in place are going to be on the condition of who's in power. And unfortunately, we're at a place in time where there's so much nastiness and divisiveness.
Oh yeah.
That folks don't even want to see clearly, think clearly. They're just willing to push on the margins, push on the edges, and push their own agendas, even when they don't make sense to themselves.
Absolutely.
Folks fighting like I don't know what for stuff and policies that are going to adversely affect them. So it just tells you about the education. So it's important for us not only to register people to vote, but to help people be educated on the matters, educated on our democracy, educated on our country, educated on the country's history. Those who are most educated act accordingly. Those who are not, they act accordingly.
Absolutely.
But we're not going to give up. The best thing that we can do is to hold all of us accountable to what this country was designed to be and said that it was going to be. And that was to be free from any oppression. That's what we were doing. We were trying to get from under the oppression of the king. That was the humane thing to do. So why do we have this conflict of oppressing people in the name of making sure some of us are not oppressed?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's not what it's all about. And so in that same vein for voting, we have made it a holiday to vote. Instead of using this holiday celebrating generals who wanted to enslave people, we X that holiday for Lee Jackson and replaced it with voting day as a holiday.
There you go.
So to make it more comfortable for people and accessible for people to participate in the voting process. So when people are getting up early in the morning at 6 a.m. trying to get to work, for those who are there early, then we would make sure that when they got off from work, they weren't breaking their necks trying to get to the polling place.
Right.
only, so let's just make voting day a holiday. That is the most appropriate thing that we could see being done. Why not vote by mail and make sure the mail system works the way it was supposed to and designed to?
Absolutely.
Why not allow early voting at our voting places and registrars' offices where they are already in there working and they're open anyway? Allow people to come on in there and vote.
That's
So
right.
all of these things have been ways that we've tried to tear down these barriers to the voting process, and there's more work to be done.
Absolutely.
We have a lopsided situation where you have a number of people tagged with felonies for reasons that they should not be. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, folks were tagged with felonies for larceny for things and matters of $200. That was the lowest threshold in the country, $200, and that was put in place in 1980. We all know that the prices of everything has gone up and changed since 1980.
Absolutely.
And yet we were still tagging people with felonies for larcenies and bad mistakes that people make in their childhood. But in today's terms, someone playing on the playground that picks up a coat or a pair of shoes, or a pair of Uggs, or
that's $200. That's over $200 these days.
Yeah, it's over 200, and then tagged with a felony. Bad mistake, but at the same time, should they pay for the rest of their lives? They can't go to college and get financial aid. They can't serve in the military. They can't have certain jobs. And then we take away the right to vote from them as though voting is a privilege. Voting is a right.
That's right.
And it should be a right, and it should be protected in a democracy. All of these things are obstacles in which we try to tear down to make it accessible to the voting booth for folks. I carry with me, as a reminder, a receipt of my grandmother's payment of her poll tax that she had paid here in Chesapeake. So I said grandmother. So that's within my generation, within arm's length, within reach. I didn't say great, 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 great grandmother. I said my grandmother. And so that wasn't that long ago, right here, where in this country, in this city, in this Commonwealth, where people were sitting down being asked silly questions about how many bubbles in a bar of soap, paying for, taxes in order to vote. I mean, all of these ridiculous things, but don't think that this stuff is so far in the past, because you can only cross over a couple of state lines and find where folks are trying to roll all of these freedoms back.
Absolutely.
And to make it hard again for people to have access to the voting booth.
Delegate Hayes, I want to spend a little bit more time on this voting piece because everything you just stated, I mean, that's positive for 2021 and not just this year, but the years after, decades after, and hopefully a century after. And again, we're focusing on positive legislation because we went through so much in 2020, 2021. So we're looking at what the impact is and how we can really hold our heads up and go into 2022 victorious. And one thing we can also hang our hats on with voting is the governor approving the Voting Rights Act of Virginia. Now, this is almost 8 years after the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated key provisions of what we know now is the 1965 Federal Voting Rights Act. So where it basically eliminated the formula for pre-clearance, thereby nullifying pre-clearance, which means that states can just make any changes they want based on the census and voting laws within their state before having the Justice Department approve it. But this new state law protects and expands access to the voting ballot box, some of the provisions you mentioned. So for those that's out there listening, you can take a look at Senate Bill 1385 and, of course, House Bill 1890, where this legislation, co-sponsored by Delegate Price and also Senator McClellan, where it expands access to the voting box. It also helps to protect the various laws and provisions in local elections, get feedback or pre-approval for voting changes, allows individuals to sue in cases of voter suppression. Now, here, when we take a look at local elections, you can seek comment or pre-approval from the Office of Attorney General. So what this does, it helps to prevent voter suppression in our state. How significant is this Voting Rights Act passed in Virginia?
It is so key because, as we mentioned before, how important voting is. But the reason voting is important is the why, right? It's not just to do it because of the history and the fighting and the things of obstruction that we face, but we understand the policy implications that will take place because of the voting process. Because it is that you've voted and you've put certain people in place, then you have a Virginia Legislative Black Caucus that fights with tenaciousness to protect them. Why do we protect them? We protect the voting process because when we're in place, that leads to other policy changes that can be made. For instance, when it comes to education in this Commonwealth of Virginia, according to the Constitution, any and all children who live in the Commonwealth of Virginia are afforded the opportunity and should have a high quality access to education.
Absolutely.
Well, that's what our Constitution says. But the problem is folks want to, and make no mistake about it, when you're talking about a budget, when you're talking about policy, because when you talk policy and legislation, there's always a budget implication that goes along with that policy. Now, there's a pie, there's a bucket of resources and taxes and money.
And it's not
available.
infinite. It's not infinite. It's limited.
It's not. There's a pie. It's finite. It's a fixed amount of revenues that are flowing in. And when that money comes in, we decide, we forecast, we project what's going to happen with those resources. And in many instances, it's because of the Constitution, it's because of the laws as to why money has to go into certain places. So, when people come up with the grandiose ideas of funding more than what's in the Constitution, right, more than just what's a human right, when they're doing that, you have to understand it is taken away from the fundamental things that have already been required and promised in our Constitution and in the state law. So when people come up with these grandiose ideas about what they're going to do with your tax money and give it away to a bunch of folks that don't need tax breaks, and make no mistake about it, whenever the least of these are promised that they're going to get some type of tax breaks and so forth and so on, you better believe you better follow the money, because the pennies that these people receive relief in, you find the top 1% getting all kind of disproportionate relief. And so you need to follow the money. And so as we head into this next session, that's exactly what we're going to do. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen in my 30 years of public life where there has been sufficient resources flowing to public education. It's just not funded the way that it should be even now. So how do you come with a proposal? And I use the operative word is taking.
Right.
How do you take money away from the public education system and propose to give it to private situations? That is not what our Constitution talks about for people to receive that public education. And to take any of those resources away from what's needed is just that. It is a shortchanging of the folks at the bottom for the few at the top. Now, if I can afford to send my kids to private schools, then, I ought to be able to do that. There's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do, but come up with your own private money to do so.
Right.
Don't go to the public space where the resources are finite and begin taking the money out of the kitty when it's not enough already to take care of all of the public needs that it's designed for. So K-12 education, we need to make sure that the schools are funded in such a way that they should be. When I say schools, that sounds like something tangible, like a fiscal plant or a facility, and that's true. But what goes along with that are teachers in the classroom. Are they being paid?
Absolutely.
What they ought to be paid? Somewhere in my recollection, I remember Virginia being below the national average in pay for our teachers. So before we touch a penny, we need to make sure that our teachers are paid above the national average. Before we touch a penny, we need to make sure that the wraparound services that go along with providing an education for our kids are such that the teachers in the classrooms have the support mechanisms in place so that they can be successful. So the teachers' aides need to be paid. The cafeteria workers need to be paid what they deserve to be paid. The custodians need to pay what they're deserving of. When it comes to school nurses in our schools, they should be funded and staffed in our schools. When it comes to mental health providers in our schools, school counselors,
absolutely,
they need to be there in our schools and to be at a ratio that's respectable for the number of kids and children that we have in our schools.
Delegate Hayes, I want you to stick around with us because this is very important. But we got to take a quick break. But in our second half hour, we're going to expand moral education, criminal justice, and some legislation that helped to ban guns on Capitol Hill. This is State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. We'll be back in just a moment.
WNSB Hot 91 is the proud media sponsor of the Holiday Toy Drive in partnership with Project Connection Foundation, the Urban League of Hampton Roads Young Professionals, and other community partners. Join us in making this holiday season special for families in need. 757, we need your help. How? We need volunteers, and we need family sponsors. For more information on how you can donate your time or sponsor a family, please log on to toydriveeventcelebration.com or wnsbonline.org. Let's be a blessing to those who otherwise may not have this holiday season. Hot 91, the soul of VA.
Program support sponsored in part by ALW Entertainment. It's a joyful holiday experience. Sunday, January 2nd at the Hampton Coliseum. Featuring Marvin Sapp.
Never would have made it.
The Clark Sisters. Charles Jenkins. And Leandra Johnson and Ricky Dillard and New G. For tickets, Ticketmaster.com. It's a joyful holiday experience. Sunday, January 2nd at 4 p.m. at the Hampton Coliseum.
Welcome back. It's Stay in the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, broadcasting live from the Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nations, from WNSB. Yes, it's the new sound of Hot 91, the soul of VA. We'd like to congratulate all the graduates who are getting ready to be conferred for your degrees. Our producer here, Marvin Folks, also known as DJ Scandalous, will be receiving his master's in cybersecurity. Again, this is the place where we see the future in you. You're joining us on this Sunday, as you always do, every Sunday at 1 o'clock here on State of the Water, where we bring movers, shakers, policymakers to you to discuss issues important to the community. The entire month of December, we're going through what we call our year in review, where we're going to really talk about a lot of positive things that's happened for us, not just here in the Spartan Nation, but our community and the Commonwealth through public policy and law and politics. And with that, we've got with us here our special guest, who's no stranger whatsoever to State of the Water, to Norfolk State University, to his district, District 77, that he represents as their delegate, or even to the Commonwealth. That's our very own Delegate Cliff Hayes. Welcome back to State of the Water, Delegate Hayes.
Happy to be back, Dr. Claville. Happy to be back.
Absolutely. In the first half hour, we talked about two areas that I believe are very important for us to take with us out of the year 2021 and be thankful to God for all that he's done for us, because 2021, 2020 were some hard years for us. But out of that tragedy, out of the hardness, out of the trials and tribulation, we got some major victories, and some of those major victories in large part were due to persons like you and our other alums and individuals in the state legislature, locally, and also on Capitol Hill. We talked about the changes in voting rights that helped us to protect our voting rights, our greatest weapon here in our democracy, the ability to vote. We also talked about education and being able to raise the teacher pay, being able to not just teacher, but teacher's aide, our cafeteria workers, custodians, all of our staff members, and ensuring that every child has a good education, because your success in life is connected to your education and opportunities. Before we left in this first half hour, you were talking about the pay and talking about the value of our staff workers. If you could, close it out for us, because I want to get to a couple other issues that I think our listeners need to really know and know that you guys champion for us.
Oh, absolutely. You've so eloquently touched on many of those matters. And I mean, if you just continue on with those positions of support, whether it's bus drivers as well, coaches, et cetera, they help counselors, et cetera, in our schools. All of these positions, the safety patrols that are allowing them to get across the street. I mean, all of these form a network of support that is a part of the whole educational process, the librarians, et cetera. I mean, I can go on and on, but the truth is we need to make sure that we fund education at the level in which it's supposed to be. And until then, there's no reason or no good reason why we should be robbing the state coffers to benefit a few to send the kids to private institutions.
Absolutely. But as persons like you, you're going to keep fighting for us in the state legislature to ensure that the dollars that were meant for our kids in public school will stay for our kids in public school.
Well, to that same point, at the very, very foundation of it all, Brother Claville, is that we have to operate with truth, honesty, decency, and courage. Operating with truth, honesty, decency, and courage will put everybody at a humane level, whether it's making sure that folks are educated, we're making sure people have proper health care, making sure people get the necessary resources that they need when they're down on their luck, making sure that our roads are taken care of. All of these things need to happen, but they need to happen in, like I said before, with truth, honesty, decency, and courage. And if you overlay every process with that, then you'll come away with good policy. When we don't overlay truth, honesty, decency, and courage over our policy initiatives, then you get it upside down. It starts to come out of balance, if you will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of balance, I want us to shift from voting rights and education to criminal justice reform. The Commonwealth of Virginia carried out and conducted the second most executions behind only Texas since the U.S. Supreme Court let states resume the death penalty in 1876. But something happened in the last legislative session as it relates to the death penalty. Tell our listeners the positive legislation that took place on the Commonwealth's behalf.
Well, when you look at historically what has happened in this country, and you have to speak from a historical perspective, that's the lens in which, through truth, honesty, and decency and courage, that we approach criminal justice reform. And so when we look at the numbers of who in this country was actually being put to death, who in this Commonwealth was actually being put to death for crimes, or allegedly put to death for crimes that they committed. And I use the term allegedly because in some instances we found that people were given the death penalty only later to find out that they were innocent of those crimes.
Absolutely.
They shouldn't. And so when you look at disproportionately how that has affected the African American community, one life is too much. One innocent life to be put away on death row, only to find that folks should not have been in that situation, should not have been on death row, should not have been put to death. And it's proven, then we ought to want to get that right. And so the Commonwealth of Virginia did just that. Legislation passed to say that we would ban the death penalty in the Commonwealth. And so that's not to say that if people have participated in heinous crimes, then they ought to be incarcerated and put away for what they do. But we need to make sure that they did it before we get into those kinds of situations, and that they've paid the price in jail for those crimes. But here in the Commonwealth, as I said, historically what we found in this country as well is that blacks are on death row disproportionately. And when you look at some of these processes in which people found themselves in those situations, the courts and the systems that put them there were operating where people have pled thinking that they were going to get, some kind of bargain or something to come out of it, and then only to find themselves put away. Or the old system of running around feeling like you got to grab somebody. And so they grab up some young man, some young female who happens to be black, and then there they are on death row. Even we see folks taking the situation into their own hands. And so you begin to ask the question, does a black life matter?
Right.
And so in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we banned the death penalty, and the governor signed it into law.
Just to say that we banned the death penalty, that is, to me, being, part of the legal system as a licensed attorney and being in the courtroom and seeing the criminal courts and seeing all the African-American males and individuals coming through there, and the poor people, whether they be of color or white, it's really a tragedy and travesty that when you take a look at the system, how individuals are still going through the system. Yeah, and again, we believe in justice, but also there's balance and fairness and equity that also has to be meted out as well. And the criminal justice system is meant for justice, but it's also meant for fairness. So to say that the legislature, to say that 100 and individuals in the House and all the senators and our executive officer, chief executive officer of the state came together with enough votes available to do it and said, we're going to ban this death penalty and say, hey, one life is too much to get it wrong. The harshest penalty you could get is life with no chance of parole. And even there's opportunity through parole for individuals, part of it through executive order and so forth, giving individuals an opportunity to get it right. That is huge. And I want our listeners to understand just how positive that is in order to, again, we're still getting justice. Justice is meted out, but there's a fairness and equity to it as well.
And then the challenge to all of that, Dr. Claville, is that justice doesn't have, or fighting for justice doesn't have a time clock. What we find is that, take for instance, in a game, you're on the field, you score a touchdown or two, folks get excited, they celebrate, and then they forget that there's another quarter to come. You still have to keep fighting. You can't. That's it. Celebrate and pick up everything and get in the easy chair. No, you have got to fight for the gains that have been made.
That's right.
And you have to keep fighting. And you come to this process with the understanding that you're not waiting for the clock to run out. There is no clock to run out. You have to keep fighting, because when you fight for justice, you fight with an understanding that there's always going to be a backlash. There's always going to be some pushback. I don't care what history you consider, but whenever people fight for justice, equality, equity, there's always backlash. And you've got to stand in a posture to be ready that when that backlash comes, that you're willing to stand for truth, honesty, decency, and courage, because these folks are standing with courage to treat you humanely. They'll travel across state lines and march and try to let you know how they feel. And so we have to stand with courage as well to show that all people will be treated equal.
Absolutely.
And that we're not going to stand for this one-sidedness these little subtleties that begin to tear away at our democracy and fairness, equity. So when you hear somebody say, I'm colorblind, and I don't see color when I look at people. Well, that's nothing to be bragging about to me. That's a form of obscurity, or do you not see me, is what I hear in that message. If you say that you're colorblind, then you're not willing to accept me for what color, what experience, what life travels that I've actually had, generation after generation, and my people. I want you to see that, recognize that, and let's sit down and talk. Don't tell me that you don't see that, or you're colorblind, because that's at its worst form, in my opinion. Saying that you're colorblind, you're not willing to see me for who I am.
Absolutely. I want to shift to this last issue, and I think it's one that really speaks to a lot of what we're seeing today in our society. We've had a couple of trials, of high-profile trials, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. We also had the Ahmaud Arbery trial, where some believe justice was meted out on one side but not the other. But the ban on guns, there's been a history of guns being able to be carried close to polling places and also on Capitol Square. And, MLK Day is a day, if you want to see the greatest contrast in our Commonwealth, come to Capitol Square on MLK Day, right? And you guys passed legislation in order to protect all citizens from needless and unnecessary intimidation and possible acts of violence that could come from irrational decisions. Tell us about what took place in those bills. What is the impact of it on Capitol Square and voting, and what do you foresee in the future?
Yeah, on the matter of guns, I was happy to carry a piece of legislation that was in the package of bills that we did to not necessarily to take away anybody's Second Amendment right, but to simply say be responsible with the weapon that you have. And that is something that's been the most prominent portion of that legislation. And so my bill said that do not leave a loaded, unattended firearm in the presence of minors. In other words, be responsible with your gun. And you would have thought that somebody was taking away air from folks in the General Assembly as they fought tirelessly to make sure that that didn't happen, that they could leave a gun on the table in front of their children. We know what that has meant time and time again, and I can't even call those situations accidents, because if you purposely have your gun loaded and you leave it recklessly in the presence of minors, that's not an accident, because you're supposed to be responsible with your weapon. That bill ended up being watered down some and made to be a misdemeanor versus the felony that we were after. But, there's justice in other ways, because we've seen what's been going on in other states, even Minnesota or Michigan, where we saw this most recent situation where a kid opened up and fired and killed several of his classmates and a teacher. And the gun was given to him by his parents. Now, I have a good friend of mine, and I'm laughing because I can't tell you for the last 3 or 4 years or so, he's been saying to me, Cliff, man, if we start to make our parents be held accountable for some of the stuff that these kids are doing, then you'll see the behavior change. Brother Askew, who's also a Norfolk State alum, Brother Mark Askew said, if you begin to hold the parents accountable, you'll see the kids start to behave differently.
Absolutely.
Because those parents will buckle down on their kids and not allow them to just run around and do things that they should not do. And if those parents knew that they were going to be held accountable if their kid acted irresponsibly with that weapon, why someone would want to purchase a Glock for their kid, 15 years old, I have no idea. But they probably just felt like they, if something happens, we won't be responsible for it. That's the paradigm that would allow that to take place. And so what we see is that prosecutor holding the parents accountable who were in humor sending text messages to their child saying, whatever you do, just don't get caught. You know, what kind of mindset is that? That is irresponsible, juvenile behavior as parents, if you ask me. But also what ended up happening with our gun legislation was to say those who may have some type of mental situation that calls into question of whether or not they need to have a weapon because they may act irresponsible. We've responded to that. The so-called red flag laws, it seemed to be a situation where someone shouldn't have a weapon. You can alert authorities, and they won't be allowed to carry that gun legally. And then, of course, trying to close up some of the loopholes at gun shows where people are riding up in there and just grabbing guns and doing all kinds of things. Chief Boone with the city of Norfolk did an interesting study here recently where he has found a trail of crime perpetrated with guns and weapons, only to find that those guns and weapons were legally obtained and then sold to individuals that shouldn't have guns.
Wow.
So these straw purchases where people are buying guns for other people, that's something that we were able to address. So all of these kinds of things, guns, weapons, the country, the Second Amendment says you have the right to bear arms, but it doesn't give you the authority to run around and wreak havoc on everybody and collect weapons that are used for the battlefield at your home. So we need to address all of these things and to fight to protect the innocent in this Commonwealth of Virginia.
Absolutely. Voting for our HBCUs. Not only that, but funding for our HBCUs, increased funding, voting changes, and protecting our voting rights for all citizens of the Commonwealth, education reform, criminal justice reform by banning the death penalty, and then also, as we talked about, banning guns from sacred spaces within certain feet of voting polls, also from Capitol Square. But not just that, but also the legislature implemented an increase in the minimum wage. As a matter of fact, minimum wage, federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. And Virginia voted to increase it to $9.50 an hour. And by January 1st of 2022, it should go to $11 an hour. January 1st, 2023, $12. January 1st, 2025, $13.50. And January 1st, 2026, $15 an hour. That affects the bottom line. In a few moments, Delegate Hayes, tell us how this really impacts our working citizens across the board.
Yes, sir, Dr. Claville, and actually that was a gradient approach because that was the compromise to be made in order to raise the minimum wage here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. To be truthful, it ought to have happened in a much quicker time frame, but that's what we had to negotiate to have for our people here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I can't tell you for $7.25 what house a Virginian will be able to buy at $7.25 an hour.
Not even 2 gallons of gas these days.
Yeah, the way gas is, and food and groceries and prescriptions, etc. And then even if you overlay that with COVID and the time in which we were in, who was it that was still out there on the front line working? And you're talking about open these restaurants back up, open these hotels back up. Guess who were waiting the tables? Guess who was changing the sheets on the beds and vacuuming the floor and, keeping the lobby clean, etc. It's the people making minimum wage. And these people are out here standing at the bus stop, catching the bus in the early hours of the morning to get to work on time. And then when they leave that job, they're going to the next job, trying to do all they can to piece it together to take care of their family. It causes all kind of problems with regards to being there and the quality of life that not only those individuals are having, but for their children who look up into the stands or out into the auditorium at the school plays, and the parents can't be there because parents are working 3 and 4 jobs trying to make it happen. It just is egregious that we would think that that's enough money for people to live on.
Absolutely. And, once again, these are just a few of the positive, impactful pieces of legislation that persons like yourself, our alums, and others in the Hampton Roads area, and our colleagues and those who are supporters of just working people, everyday people, banded together in order to pass. And listen, it wasn't easy. Like you said, we passed the Voting Rights Act 8 years after the U.S. Supreme Court nullified the various aspects of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The death penalty itself being banned since 1976. Not only that, but you talked about the minimum wage, that being a compromise. But it does show that when we continue to fight, keep our eye on the target and the goal, then anything can be accomplished. But we're not done yet because we got 2022 coming, and we're going to have you back. We're going to have you back in the new year to talk about what's on the agenda for 2022. Delegate Hayes, listen, we want to thank you so much for being a friend to State of the Water, being a friend to the Norfolk State University, your alma mater, and thank you for being my good friend as well. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here, Dr. Claville, and to the Spartan Nation. Behold, it's time for us to always throw the rope back.
Absolutely. I appreciate you, sir. All right. We'll talk. So, again, this entire series, in December, we're looking at positive things that have happened because we got so much to be thankful for. 2021 was a hard year, Marvin, but we made it through, again, because of the grace and mercies of God. So be thankful in all that you have and all that you do, because tomorrow's not promised. So make an impact today. Remember, giants come in all sizes. Never underestimate your value, because it only takes one to create change and to start a movement that will impact generations to come. This is State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, where we bring movers, shakers, and policymakers to you to discuss issues important to the community. Make sure you join us every Sunday here on WNSB, the new sound of Hot 91, the soul of EA, on the campus of the Norfolk State University. Until next time, God bless. We'll see you next Sunday.